Hey everybody, this is a piece by Cornelius Castoriadis titled Socialism and Autonomous Society. It's originally published as Introduction Socialisme et Société Autonome. For the title of this book, Les contenus du socialisme, I have retained the title of two of its principal texts. Nevertheless, it is obvious that henceforth the terms, quote, socialism and, quote, communism are to be abandoned. Of course, the signification attached to any word in language is theoretically and at the outset conventional and arbitrary. This, however, is precisely what also makes significations ultimately be only what they have become through actual historical usage. To give a purer meaning to the words of a tribe is perhaps the task of the poet or the philosopher. It certainly is not the politician's. Whether one deplores it or not, for the overwhelming majority of people today, socialism signifies the regime instaurated in Russia and in similar countries, quote, really existing socialism, end quote, as Mr. Brezhnev has aptly put it, a regime that brings exploitation, oppression, totalitarian terror, and cultural cretinization to new heights in human history. Or it signifies parties directed by Monsieur Mitterrand, Callahan, Schmidt, et al., namely, quote, political, end quote, cogs of the established order in Western countries. These massive realities cannot be combated through etymological and semantic distinctions. That would be like wanting to combat the bureaucracy of the church by reminding people that ecclesia originally signified the assembly of the people, here of the hope of the faithful, and that, in relation to this originary meaning, the real power of the Pope, of the Vatican, of the cardinals, and so on, constitutes a usurpation. Indeed, should we, in the case being discussed, even be deploring the fate of these words? That their utilization by Leninist, Stalinist, and reformist bureaucracies has been one of the greatest instruments of mystification in history is certain. That, however, is something that has already happened, and we can do nothing about it. Besides that fact, we must also note that from the outset the terms were, quote, bad, end quote, inasmuch as a word can be. Either they are tautologous or they are dangerously ambiguous. What does it mean to be, quote, socialist, end quote, or even, quote, communist, end quote? To advocate society, sociality, or community, and to be against what? Every society has always been and always will be, quote, socialist, end quote. It would be merely a truism to say that every society is social or is not a society. Society is always, quote, socialist, end quote, because society is always arranged with a view towards society's maintenance as a instituted society, instituted in this or that given way, and society subordinates everything to this maintenance, to its preservation, conservation, affirmation, and reproduction as this or that society. The most wildly individualistic society is still, quote, socialist, end quote, in the sense that it affirms and imposes this signification, this fabrication, this social, and thus not natural, rational, or transcendent value that is the individual. What in the human being is not socially fabricated individual, the sayable representation that, quote, I am an individual, such and such an individual, end quote, obviously is a part of this fabrication and is one of its results, is the physical monad, is the psychical monad, which lies at the boundary of the knowable and the accessible, and is, as such, radically unfit for life. Nor just for life in society, but for life itself. For as such, the psychical monad is radically mad, irrational, afunctional. Even if this elementary fact has been placed at the center of our reflection on the subject since Freud, and thanks to Freud, it has always been known and formulated by thinkers as varied as Plato, Aristotle, and Diderot. It is only by means of its occultation that for the past 10 years new varieties of confusion and mystification have been able to flourish, the glorification of, quote, desire, end quote, of the, quote, libido, end quote, the discovery of a, quote, mimetic, end quote, desire, and the latest bit of junk launched onto the market by the advertising department of the ideas industry, a pseudo, quote, religious, end quote, revival of classical liberalism. Such as they are, and whatever they say, all share the same incredible postulate, the fiction of a, quote, individual, end quote, that would come into the world fully equipped and determined as to its essential features, and that would be corrupted, oppressed, enslaved by society, by sociality as such. Or as the term socialism is ripe with a danger, or else the term, quote, socialism, end quote, is ripe with a dangerous ambiguity. The term socialism seems to posit a material, substantive, quote, value-laden, end quote, primacy for society over the individual, as if there could be, quote, choices, quote, options, end quote, for society and against the individual. On the theoretical level, the level of ideas and concepts, such an opposition is, as I just said, nonsense. It is also fallacious and mystificatory on the practical level. It remains caught in bourgeois philosophy and bourgeois ideology and the false problematic created by this ideology. It ultimately becomes an ideological cover for totalitarianism as it nourishes by opposition a pseudo-individualism or pseudo-liberalism. Victorian society, and more generally the society of classical and, quote, liberal, end quote, capitalism is, quote, individualistic, end quote, at least it proclaims to be so. What does this mean? That Victorian society or liberal capitalism allows a small minority of, quote, individuals, end quote, which liberal society fabricates to oppress and exploit the great majority of the other, quote, individuals, end quote. Liberal society functions against the quote, individual, end quote, in 90% of cases. And what does the fact that Russian society today is a society of exploitation and oppression signify? Is it that each individual is oppressed and exploited for the benefit of the collectivity, that is to say, for the benefit of all the others and therefore also of itself? Certainly not. Each of the individuals making up the Russian people is not oppressed and exploited by the Russian people, but by the communist bureaucracy, that is to say, by a particular sociological grouping of individuals. Russian society is an authentically, quote, individualistic, end quote, society for 10% of the individuals making up this society. Societies that fabricate servile individuals, that is to say, nearly all known societies apart from the Greek democratic city and the Greek democratic city's modern inheritors, are not enslaved to the collectivity, which once again would make no sense. Servile individuals are enslaved to the given institution of society, which is another matter entirely. The savage is not enslaved to the tribe as actual collectivity. The savage and the collectivity are enslaved to the rules established by the, quote, ancestors, end quote. The Jew, the Christian, and the Muslim are not enslaved to the Jewish, Christian, or Muslim collectivity. The Jew, the Christian, and Muslim are slaves of the given institutions of their society. of a law that is immutable and intangible, since that law's origin is imputed to a transcendent source, God. Even in Greece at Sparta, the Spartan is not enslaved to the Spartans, but to Sparta and to what makes Sparta Sparta, not Sparta's geographical location, but Sparta's laws, which are posited as intangible and are attributed in the main to a mythical or mythified founder, Lycurgus, or Lycurgus, Lycurgus. The mythical law origin of the law, like God's gift of the tables of the law to Moses, like Christian revelation or Muslim prophecy, has the same signification and the same function to ensure the conservation of a heteronymous institution of society by incorporating into this institution the representation of an extra-social origin of the law, which is thereby posited by definition and by its existence as removed from the instituting activity of human beings. On the other hand, and this is a truism, where there has been a rupture of instituted heteronomy, we witness the simultaneous appearance of the autonomous individual and the autonomous collectivity. More exactly, we witness the appearance of the political idea and the political question of the autonomy of the individual and of the collectivity, each of which is possible and has meaning only through the other. We are speaking of the individual as we know it on the basis of a few examples, and as we want it for everyone, we are speaking of the autonomous individual, which, while knowing that it is caught up within a senseless (asensé) and world order/disorder, wills itself and makes itself responsible for what it is, for what it says, for what it does. This individual is born at the same time as, and through the same movement by which the city, the polis, emerges as autonomous collectivity. That is to say, it does not receive its laws from any instance that would be eternal or superior to it. Rather, it posits these laws itself for itself. The rupture of mythical or religious heteronomy, the contesting of instituted social imaginary significations, the recognition of the historically created character of the institution, of the law, of nomos, are to a blinding degree inseparable from the birth of philosophy, from unlimited interrogation, and knows no inner-worldly or otherworldly authority, just as the birth of philosophy is impossible and inconceivable outside of democracy. In Greece, democracy was also called at the outset isonomy, equality of the law for everyone. But what is the law? The law is not only the, quote, formal, end quote, law, which in modern societies is written, law in the narrow sense. Law is the institution of society. Equality and liberty, I will return to the relationship between these two ideas, cannot be limited to some domains alone, so that one would guarantee, for example, the equal right of all individuals to a legal defense in court, while, quote, forgetting, end quote, the actual operation of these courts, which could, and in reality today, even in so-called democratic societies, do make of this equality the mask for inequality. Equality and liberty cannot be the liberty and the equality of all to establish an individual, quote, company, end quote, when at the same time the actual institution of society makes of this right a sinister mockery of 4/5 of all individuals. I do not remember which socialist, parenthesis, it was bracket Edward and bracket Bellamy, I think, who noted the fact that, with equal rigor, the law forbids everyone, rich and poor, from sleeping under bridges. Today, some people trot out Hayek's, Schumpeter's, and Popper's arguments about, quote, private property, end quote, and, quote, free enterprise, end quote, as foundations of democracy and freedom, bracket, liberté, end bracket, parenthesis, without, of course, mentioning where these arguments came from and presenting them as new, end parenthesis. And they continue to cover up the fact that private property and free enterprise, as they operate in the conditions of the modern world, are only the institutional mask for actual domination by a small minority. The inequality and servitude, the exploitation and oppression characteristic of Western capitalist societies are not given any backing or justified by the fact that, with one or several decades of delay, depending upon individual cases and histories, most people are now discovering or pretending to discover the horrors of Stalinist or Maoist totalitarianism. Criticism of the actual way in which, quote, individual rights, end quote, function in societies dominated by a minority is not canceled out because some people have recognized the fact that rights wrested from capitalism by people's struggles in Western countries are not merely, quote, formal, end quote. These rights have never been, quote, formal, end quote, in the sense of, quote, empty, end quote. These rights have always been, however, partial, incomplete, and they remain so. They will necessarily, tautologically, remain partial, incomplete, so long as society remains asymmetrically and antagonistically divided between directors and executants, rulers and ruled. What was intended by the term, quote, socialist society, end quote, we henceforth call autonomous society. An autonomous society implies autonomous individuals and vice versa. Autonomous society, autonomous individuals, free society, free individuals. Freedom, but what is freedom? And what freedom? What is at issue is not philosophical or metaphysical freedom. The latter exists or does not. But if metaphysical freedom does exist, metaphysical freedom is as absolute and inviolable for a Descartes reflecting in his garret as for the prisoner beaten and tortured by the Gestapo, the KGB, or the Argentine police. What is at issue is not inner freedom, but effective social concrete freedom. Namely, to mention one primary feature, the largest possible space for movement and activity the institution of society can ensure for the individual. This freedom can exist only as dimension and mode of the institution of society. And the institution of society is what politics in the authentic sense of the term intends. Only a moron or a charlatan, our era offers a rich sampling of these two varieties and their apparently paradoxical combinations, can claim to be interested in freedom and to be disinterested in the question of, quote, the state, end quote, in the question of politics. Now, in this sense, freedom implies actual equality and vice versa. Conceived in this way, equality, of course, is meant in its social instituted sense, not metaphysical or, quote, natural, end quote, equality, but equality of rights and of duties, of all rights and duties, and of all the effective possibilities of making/doing, bracket, faire, end bracket, that depend for each person on the institution of society. For, to take an example, social inequality is always also inequality of power. Social inequality becomes immediately inequality of participation in instituted power. How can you be free if the others have more power than you? In its effective social sense, power is bringing someone or someones to make/do what they would not have otherwise, in full knowledge of the relevant facts, willed to make/do. Now, as the idea of a society without any power at all is an incoherent fiction, the first part of the response to the question of freedom is equal participation of all in power. A free society is a society in which power is actually, bracket, effectivement, end bracket, exercised by the collectivity, but a collectivity in which all effectively participate in equality. And this equality of effective participation as goal to attain must not remain a purely formal rule. It must be ensured as much as possible by actual institutions. Let us open a parenthesis here. I have already said that the idea of a society without any power is an incoherent fiction. One might be tempted to say that an autonomous society would aim simply at limiting to the greatest extent possible the field pertaining to collective power in order to enlarge the maximum extent possible the field of effective individual autonomy. That, however, is only half true. Clearly, contemporary society's heteronomy, even in its most, quote, democratic, end quote, forms, implies much more than an undue, unjustified, unnecessary limitation. It implies a mutilation of individual autonomy, of the field of movement and activity of individuals, as well as, moreover, of the various particular collectivities making up society. It in no way follows, however, that an autonomous society must intend as end in itself the disappearance of all collective power. Only for those fragments of human beings that are contemporary pseudo-individualist intellectuals is the collectivity evil. Freedom is freedom to make/do, and making/doing is power, and to make/do all alone as well as power to make/do with others. To make/do with others is to participate, to become engaged, to connect with others in a shared activity, and to accept an organized coexistence and collective undertakings in which decisions are made in common and executed by all those who have participated in their formation. The confusion over the relationship between freedom and equality dates back a long time. It exists in as profound a thinker as Tocqueville, and Marx, in his naive contempt for the political question, which constituted the flip side of Marx's naive belief that all questions would be solved, or rather dissolved, once the relations of production were transformed, did nothing to dissipate it. This confusion is possible only if one holds to the most superficial, the most inconsequential, the most formal acceptations precisely of the terms, quote, freedom and, quote, equality. As soon as they are given their full weight, as soon as they are provided with the ballast of instituted social actuality, they appear indissociable. Only equal men can be free, and only free men can be equal. Since there necessarily is power in society, those who do not participate in this power on an equal footing come under the domination of those who do participate in power and exercise power, and therefore they are not free, even if they have the idiotic illusion of being free, because they would have decided to live and die idiots, that is to say, as mere private individuals. Idiotoyen, I don't know how to say it. IDIOTEUEIN. And such participation, this is evidently one of the points on which the modern workers' movement has gone further than the Greek democracy, can be equal only if the actual social and not just juridical conditions granted to all are equal. Conversely, in a society in which people are not free, there can be no equality. No need to argue the point. Other men exercise all sorts of powers over these unfree men, and between the free and the unfree an essential inequality is instaurated. 1 second. Sad but true, one can still hear today that socialism achieves equality but to the detriment of freedom, that we should therefore opt for regimes that preserve freedom while sacrificing equality. Let us pass over the tacit assumption that total and totalitarian bureaucratic capitalist regimes would be, quote, socialist, end quote. When questions as serious as this are discussed, one cannot limit oneself to endorsing sociologically and politically the name a regime gives itself. If one did so, one would then also have to accept the Stalinist assertion that the Russian Constitution is the most democratic in the world, and the argument falls under its own weight. But pray tell me, where have self-proclaimed, quote, socialist, end quote, regimes ever achieved equality? What kind of economic, social, political equality is there between the bureaucratic caste ruling in Russia or in China, the middle-level bureaucracy, and the masses of workers, peasants, service workers, petty employers, and lower-level functionaries? The regimes that have usurped the term, quote, socialism, end quote, are only, quote, less liberal, end quote. Bracket, a sinister litotes, Litotes, than others. They are certainly also much more strongly inegalitarian, and this from all points of view, including from the real economic standpoint. Let us leave aside, however, the other points of view in order to avoid quibblings over secondary issues. How can one say that equality has been achieved in a society in which some can put others in concentration camps? What is this strange pseudo-Marxist blindness that identifies equality in general, and even economic equality, with the elimination of private owners of the means of production and their replacement by a privileged, irremovable, self-co-opting, self-perpetuating ruling bureaucracy, and cannot see that only the form of inequality has thereby been changed? A strange amnesia, too, which has wiped out 2 centuries at least of social criticism and sociological analysis, going to show the partial, truncated, and diverted, and dissuasive, and so often fictive and illusory character of liberties and freedom under the capitalist republic. Once again, what does one mean by liberties? Have capitalist societies ceased to be societies of domination? If the majority of society is dominated by a minority, can this majority be called free? One cannot claim to be interested in, quote, freedom, end quote, and then reduce freedom to a limited and essentially, quote, passive, end quote, aspect, that of, quote, individual rights, end quote. Neither can one reduce, quote, individual rights, end quote, to the narrow juridico-political sphere to which they are confined in the countries labeled, quote, democratic, end quote. Freedom requires, first of all, the elimination of the instituted domination of every particular group within society. The institution of this domination is not formally, quote, written, end quote, into modern constitutions. The Russian Constitution does not explicitly state that society is dominated by the party/state bureaucracy any more than constitutions in Western countries mention that society is dominated by a group of capitalist and big bureaucrats. There is no doubt that, in the second case, both individual rights and the political regime in the narrow sense, as well as many other factors, limit this domination and sometimes permit a counterbalancing of such domination or effective opposition to it. That, however, is not the subject of our discussion. Everything happens as if the sudden, quote, discovery, end quote, of Russian totalitarianism by a few late adolescents and some other more mature and slightly overripe melons functioned so as to throw a new veil of mystification over the depths of the social and political question. Here again, strange objective collusions not together. The Russian people are atrociously oppressed. The Russian people are not, however, only oppressed. The Russian people are also exploited, as a few other peoples are. On that point, the new and comfortable Western champions of, quote, human rights, end quote, no more than Stalinist, Trotskyist, and CEREsians, and the, quote, socialist, end quote, utter not a word. Now, other people are exploited too. Let us grant a shortened discussion that the struggle for, quote, political rights, end quote, in the narrow sense precedes other struggles. And let us suppose that, by some miracle, the Russian bureaucracy is led to, quote, democratize, end quote, its rule. Would that mean that Russia's social and political question has been settled? Would the social and political question in France today be resolved by the elimination of judicial and police, quote, errors, end quote? Long live freedom. But watch out, freedom must stop at the company gates. No question of being free in one's job, and no question that those who really work are free, for the intellectual who discourses on this question is himself free in his, quote, work, end quote, insofar as his mental constitution allows. One can continue one's parrot-like litanies on Marx, the precursor of totalitarianism, and so forth, but one will remain the slave of his fundamental and capitalistic postulate. Work is the realm of necessity, which amounts to saying slavery. Apart from that, one tells the tale that self-management is a form of totalitarianism. Indeed, how could we ever have doubted that an assembly line is the most perfected form of the monotheistic republic, and the chosen land of true spiritual freedom? There is nothing left to do but mentally try to communicate with an undiscoverable transcendence. Men who are slaves in their work the greater part of their waking life, and who then fall asleep exhausted in front of a brutalizing and manipulatory television set, are not and cannot be free. The suppression of heteronomy both ends the domination of particular social groups over the whole society and modifies the relationship instituted society has with its institution. It breaks society's enslavement to its institution. Both aspects appear with blinding clarity in the case of production and work. The domination of a particular group over society could not be abolished without abolishing the domination of particular groups over the production and work process, without abolishing the bureaucratic hierarchy in the business firm as everywhere else. From then on, the only conceivable mode of organization for production and work is collective management by all those who participate, as I have not ceased to argue since 1947. Later on, this was called, quote, self-management, end quote, autogestion, usually in order to make of it a reformist cosmetic with the existing state of affairs, or a, quote, testing ground, end quote, while carefully remaining quiet about the colossal implications upstream and downstream of the idea of self-management. Here I will mention only two of these implications, which I had already brought out in 1955 to 57 in the first two parts of On the Content of Socialism. Genuine collective management, active participation by everyone in all shared endeavors would be inconceivable in practical terms if pay differentials were to be maintained. Moreover, strictly nothing in any respect could justify their maintenance. Self-management implies equality in all wages, incomes, etc. On the other hand, self-management would rapidly collapse from within if self-management were only a question of quote, self-managing, end quote, the existing piling up of excrement. Self-management could neither consolidate itself nor develop unless self-management entailed, ultimately, a conscious transformation of existing technology, of instituted technology, so as to adapt this technology to the needs, wishes, and wills of human beings, both as producers and as consumers. Now, not only do we not see how any a priori limits could be set on this transformation, but it is evident that there could be none. One can, if one wants, call self-management, quote, self-organization, end quote. But the self-organization of what? Self-organization is also the self-organization of the socially and historically inherited conditions within which this self-organization unfolds. And these conditions, instituted conditions, embrace everything. The machines, tools, and instruments of work, but just as much its products. The work setting, but also living spaces, that is, one's habitat, the relationship between the two, and of course also and especially its present and future subjects, human beings, their social training, formation, their education in the deepest sense of the word, their paideia. Self-management and self-organization are either collections of sounds employed to amuse people, or self-management and self-organization signify precisely this: the explicit self-institution of society, knowing itself as such and elucidated as much as possible. This is the conclusion one reaches whether one approaches the question most concretely in daily life or most abstractly, most philosophically. Freedom does not have merely the, quote, passive or, quote, negative aspect of protecting a sphere of individual existence in which its autonomous power of making/doing, pouvoir faire, would be recognized and guaranteed by law. Even more important is its active and positive aspect, on which depends, moreover, in the long and even the short term, the preservation of the former. Laws are scraps of paper without the activity of citizens, judges, and courts, cannot remain impartial and incorruptible in a society of, quote, individualistic and, quote, sheep who have no interest in what power does. Freedom, autonomy, necessarily implies active and egalitarian participation in all social power where decisions concerning common affairs are made. The liberal, idiotic intellectual can, if he is sufficiently stupid, think he is free to enjoy the privileges the instituted social order confers upon him, forgetting thereby that he has decided nothing about the junk sold him, about the news presented to him, or about the air he breathes. And he can remain in this idiotic state until the day he will freely receive on his head an H-bomb, the launching of which has been freely decided by others. To be able to decide, however, is not only to be able to decide about, quote, current affairs, end quote, to participate in a state of affairs considered sacrosanct. Autonomy signifies giving oneself one's law, and we are speaking here of, quote, formal, end quote, informal, end quote, common or shared laws, namely institutions. To participate in power is to participate in instituting power. It is to belong, in equality with others, to a collectivity that self-institutes itself explicitly. Freedom in an autonomous society is expressed by these two fundamental laws: no execution of decisions without egalitarian participation in the making of decisions, and no law without egalitarian participation in the positing of the law. An autonomous collectivity has for its motto and self-definition, quote, we are those whose law is to give ourselves, quote, we are those whose law is to give ourselves our own laws, end quote. This active and positive aspect of freedom, of the autonomy of society, is indissociably linked to the question of the autonomy of the individual. An autonomous society implies autonomous individuals, and such individuals can fully exist only in an autonomous society. Now, what each does, both with regard to the collectivity and with regard to himself, depends to a decisive degree on his social fabrication as an individual, quote, inner freedom, end quote, itself, not only in the sense of effective freedom to think, but even in the sense of, quote, free will, end quote, depends on the institution of society and on what kind of individual this institution produces. Quote, free will, end quote, can never be exercised except between alternatives actually given to the individual that appear to the individual as possible. Quote, free will, end quote, will never allow the subject of an oriental despot to think that perhaps the God King is simply crazy or feeble-minded. No Jew of the classical era is, quote, free, end quote, to think that perhaps everything recounted in Genesis is only a myth. Before Greece, no member of society has ever had, as far as we know, the possibility of thinking. Our laws are perhaps bad. Our gods are perhaps false gods. Our representation of the world is perhaps purely conventional. Hegel was highly mistaken when he said that the Asiatic world experienced the freedom of a single person, the Greco-Roman world the freedom of a few. The, quote, single, end quote, Asiatic person, the monarch, is not, quote, free, end quote. He can think only what the institution of society makes him think. And if Greece inaugurates freedom in a profound sense, despite slavery and the condition of women, it is that everyone can think otherwise. For the individual to be able to think, quote, freely, end quote, even inwardly, society must raise and educate it, fabricate it as individual capable of thinking freely. Something very few societies in history have done. To do so, the creation, the institution, of a public space for thought open to interrogation is required. Quite obviously, this immediately excludes the positing of law, of the institution as immutable, just as it radically excludes the idea of a transcendent source of the institution, of a law given by God or by gods, by nature or even by reason, at least if by reason is meant a set of exhaustive, categorical, and atemporal determinations, if is meant thereby anything other than the very movement of human thought. At the same time and correlatively, this implies an education in the profoundest sense, a paideia that forms individuals to have the effective possibility of thinking by themselves, which once again is the last thing in the world human beings would possess from birth or by divine endowment. Let us add that to think by oneself is psychically impossible, not only if someone else, designated by name, here below or in heaven, is posited as source of truth, but also if what one thinks or does not think matters little or makes no difference. In other words, if one does not hold oneself responsible, not for one's fantasies, but for one's words and deeds, which are the same thing. The radical questioning of the instituted imaginary and the aim of democracy, which were born in and through the ancient city, were taken up again in the modern era by the intellectual and political movement that had its first culmination in Enlightenment philosophy and the American and French revolutions in the 18th century, which themselves were anticipated in part by the English Revolution of the 17th century. From the beginning of the 19th century and half a century before Marx came into the picture, the nascent workers' movement adopted these as their own, while considerably enlarging upon them. This enlargement expressed itself in the transcendence, dépassement, and not the forgetting, of the narrow, quote, political, end quote, field. From its origins, with the idea of the, quote, social republic, end quote, the workers' movement extends the signification and aim of democracy. Criticism of the established order and democratic demands tackle not only the issue of the, quote, political, end quote, system of rule in the narrow sense, but also those of economic organization, education, and the family. This becomes clearly manifest in the osmosis that occurs between the workers' movement and the various currents of, quote, utopian, end quote, socialism during the entire first half of the 19th century and even afterward. In fact, until the Marxist noose was tightened around and finally came to choke the movement's social creativity. At the outset, sometimes later on, Marx was inspired by the best in this historical creation. From the outset, too, however, Marx displayed the rationalistic, scientistic, theoretistic tendency that rapidly gained the upper hand and practically crushed the other one. This second tendency induced him to seek an overall and complete explanation of society and of history, to believe that he had discovered it in the, quote, determining, end quote, role of production, and finally to erect the, quote, development, end quote, of production into the universal key for the comprehension of history and the Archimedean point for the transformation of society. Marx was thereby led, in fact, and regardless of what at times he might have continued to think and to say, to narrow down greatly the field of the movement's preoccupations and aims, to concentrate completely on questions of production, economy, and, quote, classes, end quote, defined on the basis of production and economy, and quite naturally to ignore or to downplay all the rest, saying or implying that the solution to all other problems would arrive as part of the bargain when the capitalists were expropriated. The political question in the broad sense, the question of the overall institution of society, the political question in the narrow sense, power, power's nature, how power is organized, the possibility of the collectivity effectively exercising power, and the problems this exercise of power raises, are ignored if, or, at best, envisaged as corollaries that will be established as soon as the main theorem is demonstrated in the practice of revolution. That Marx and Marxism were on that basis able to exercise a preponderant and, in truth, catastrophic influence over the workers' movement in numerous countries is not simply the effect of Marx's genius, and still less of some kind of Satanism on Marx's part. The centrality and sovereignty of production and of the economy, and the corresponding reduction of the entire social and political problematic, are nothing other than the organizing themes of the dominant imaginary of that era, and of ours, the capitalist imaginary. As I have tried to show since 1955 in the first two parts of On the Content of Socialism, in Proletariat and Organization, in Modern Capitalism and Revolution, in my general introduction, in The Question of the History of the Workers' Movement, the workers' movement's, quote, reception, end quote, of Marxism, Marxism's penetration into the workers' movement, has in fact been the reintroduction into the resurgence within this movement of the principal social imaginary significations of capitalism, of those significations from which it had tried to disengage itself during the preceding period. Confusion and interference. Marx and Marxism, thus introduced into the ideas, categories of thought, and objectives of the socialist workers' movement, have been enormous in all areas, and we are still paying for the consequences. Where only each time someone tells you, yes, but Russia is socialist since there is no longer any capitalists. Nowhere, however, has this confusion been more pernicious than in the field of politics proper. I will try to provide an illustration with one particularly, quote, rich, end quote, example, the idea of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. An almost impossible knot of mystification. It has become a sinister and macabre farce since 1917. Marx considered one of his original contributions to be the idea that a historical phase characterized by the quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, is inserted between capitalism and communism. The term long signified for Marx the proletariat's dictatorial use of the existing state power and the state apparatus for the purpose of transforming society. In this, Marx fell short of the historical experience he had before his eyes. He proved incapable of drawing the conclusion that follows from the Great French Revolution, which is quite in keeping with his own, quote, theory of history, end quote. Namely, that the revolution had not and simply could not use the old, ancien, quote, state apparatus, end quote, for its own purposes, that the revolution had to overturn this apparatus completely, that the revolution had been marked, in this as in all other domains, by extraordinary and profoundly innovative instituting activity from 1789 until at least Thermidor. Even the most brilliant of thinkers sometimes walks crab style. Marx had to await the creation in 1871 of a new institutional form by the workers and people of Paris, the Commune, to see it in this creation, the, quote, finally found form, end quote, of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and to draw the obvious lesson that the socialist revolution cannot simply make use of the old state apparatus, that it has to destroy this apparatus and create in its place a power, quote, which is no longer a state in the proper sense of the term, end quote, because it is nothing other than the people organized, because it is characterized by the election and permanent revocability of all those who exercise public, quote, functions, end quote. 1 second. Excuse me, let me repeat that sentence. Marx had to wait until the creation in 1871 of a new institutional form by the workers and people of Paris, the Commune, to see in this creation the, quote, finally found form, end quote, of, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and to draw the obvious lesson that the socialist revolution cannot simply make use of the old state apparatus, that it has to destroy this apparatus and create in this apparatus's place a power, quote, which is no longer a state in the proper sense of the term, end quote, because it is nothing other than the people organized, because it is characterized by the election and permanent revocability of all those who exercise public, quote, functions, end quote, by the abolition of the privileges of officialdom, functionaries, etc. This is the conception, as we know, that Lenin defended in 1917 before October in State and Revolution. Neither Marx nor Engels nor Lenin spoke for a single second of the party as, quote, organ, end quote, still less as, quote, leading organ, end quote, of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. They can be reproached for having ignored precisely the problem of the party and of parties, namely that of possible and even inevitable political divisions within the, quote, proletariat, end quote. But they cannot be criticized for having, in their writings, identified the power of the proletariat with the power of its party. After October, in Lenin and in Trotsky, a radical change took place. In State and Revolution, Lenin explained that the power of the proletariat is nothing but the power of mass organs, that every state apparatus separate from the population must disappear, and so forth. The very term, quote, party does not exist as a political concept in State and Revolution. Now, as soon as power is, quote, taken, end quote, the practice of Lenin, of Trotsky, and of the Bolshevik Party has strictly nothing to do with this previous conception. One-party rule quickly settles in and is consolidated. It is of no avail to bring up the petty arguments Lenin and especially Trotsky later tried to use to justify this practice. It is important that it's interesting to note that Trotsky, I'm not an expert on this, but according to Barak Knai Paz, an author on a book that's like a intellectual biography of Trotsky. I mean, I don't know if it's like what Trotskyists think of it, but not that that necessarily matters, but it matters something to some degree. Other experts on Trotsky have to say about it. But it's important to note that like a lot of the developments that happened actually within Russia based upon the Leninist model were already predicted and criticized by Trotsky when Trotsky was still a Menshevik, using the words substitutionism to criticize um, the way that he viewed Bolshevism as substituting itself and its leadership in its conception of revolution uh, for the dictatorship of the proletariat, substituting itself for the proletariat as its representative, as its meaning that the dictatorship of the proletariat envisioned by the Bolsheviks when Trotsky, according to Trotsky, when Trotsky was a Menshevik, um, consisted of a type of substitutionalism that viewed the party and the leadership, thus the leadership of the party, as the prime agent of social of revolution and also political rule after the revolution. So it's interesting that Trotsky totally switched gears on that topic throughout the as the Bolshevik Revolution continued. Anyway, it is of no avail to bring up the petty arguments Lenin and especially Trotsky later tried to use to justify this practice. To say that the Bolshevik Party was obliged in self-defense to assume power on its own because all the other parties were betraying or combating the revolution is a pure and simple lie. Neither the anarchists nor all socialist revolutionaries nor even the Mensheviks were opposed to the revolution. They were opposed to Bolshevik policy. In truth, the, quote, justification, end quote, of one-party rule was clearly given by Lenin 2 or 3 years later in left-wing communism and infantile distorter, using the same kind of plotting arguments as are found in materialism and imperio-criticism. In society, there are classes. Classes are represented by parties. Parties are led by leaders. That is the only point made there. To every class, quote, truly, end quote, corresponds one and only one party. To every party, one and only one possible political line, therefore, also one and only one team of leaders expressing, defending, representing this line. How then could this position, which taken in itself would testify either to ignorance or to endless stupidity, neither of which of course can be attributed either to Lenin or to Trotsky, ever have gained any plausibility? There are only two possible ways. Both are anchored to the bottommost depths of the Marxian system, and both illustrate once again the antinomy between the Marxian system and the revolutionary germs of Marx's thought still manifest in his recognition of the innovative character of the Paris Commune. Either the proletariat arrives at the point of the revolution perfectly homogenized, not only from the point of view of its, quote, position, end quote, within the relations of production and of its, quote, interest, end quote, but also and especially with respect to the representation it gives itself or its position, of its interests, of its aspirations, etc. This homogenization also and necessarily including automatic or almost automatic agreement as to the means to be used in order to instaurate a new society. This, in its turn, would imply A, that the evolution of the capitalist economy and of capitalist society actually performs such a homogenization as far as its essential features are concerned, and, to be rigorous about it, on a worldwide scale. In this regard, the cleavage of thought not only among Marxists but in Marx and Lenin themselves should be noted. On the one hand, they must uphold a theory of the capitalist economy and of capitalist society that will guarantee this homogenization. Broadly speaking, the Social Chemistry of Capital, Volume 1, whereby capital is constantly being, being disposited as the positive pole and the proletariat as the negative pole. On the other hand, they know for a fact that this image is false. Cf. the dicta of the old Marx and Engels on the English working class, or of Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, on the, quote, labor aristocracy, end quote. We know, of course, that such a homogenization does not and could not exist. Furthermore, the preceding conditions must be insufficient. The second implication is B, that this homogenization of, quote, real existence, end quote, automatically corresponds a unified and adequate consciousness. Quote, real homogenization, end quote, would indeed serve no purpose if, quote, illusions, end quote, false representations, end quote, were to persist. In other words, one will have to have recourse to the crudest, most mechanical version of, quote, reflection theory, end quote, as was practiced by the likes of Mr. Roger Garaldi before he discovered the light of Christ. Roger Garaldi was a member of the French Communist Party. Take what I'm saying with a grain of salt and look it up on your own. But Roger Garaldi was like the humanist side of the French Communist Party, which would be like in distinction to Althusser, so-called structuralism. And you could say so-called humanism about Garaldi. But Garaldi, I believe, married a woman of an Islamic woman, and converted to Islam, and eventually became a Holocaust denier. And there's a couple people. If you listen to the thing by one of the things with that Lauren Goldner wrote about this kind of like sort of like reactionary book written about the ultra left. It details how like a certain segment of, or at least one person and few followers of an owner of a Bordigist bookstore in France eventually became to be a Holocaust denier. Kind of having is a very creepy kind of thing, like having this sort of idea that anti-fascism built the consensus of the post-World War II establishment, and it fundamentally needed the Holocaust in order to mystify people into accepting the status quo on anti-fascist grounds. And so he viewed that like the exaggeration of the crimes of fascism by the post-war establishment, both in the Soviet bloc and in the Western bloc, they needed the crimes of fascism as fucking legitimation tools for themselves. And basically kind of went on this thing where like, the Holocaust was basically like a big exaggeration or didn't happen. And so it was kind of like, I think he just outright in the end became like a fascist. But I think in the beginning there was some kind of weird like extension of like kind of like, in my opinion at least, very crass critique of anti-fascism of Bordiga. Obviously there's critiques to be made of anti-fascism by all kinds of libertarian I wouldn't describe Bordiga as a libertarian by any means, but by like a left communist, libertarian communist, anarchist perspective. I mean, that's fundamentally what a lot of people criticize the Popular Front, the class collaborationist element within the mainstream socialist parties within France, and it was including the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. I mean, not France, Spain, in destroying the workers' movement, the revolutionary workers' movement in Spain, incriminating the anarchists as well as the Bolshevik Leninists, the Trotskyist Party, and the Party of Marxist Unification. So there's criticisms to be made of anti-fascism, but there's also it's kind of like, I don't know, like there's very dangerous analogies there. I think there's definitely some sloppy thinking that could come out of that kind of analysis, especially if one is so really proposed to being kind of iconoclastic and chest thumping. I think that on a side note, there's I think it's by Dirk Brownstein, who's like, I think wrote like is recently put out a book with Haymarket Books, titled Adorno's Critique of Political Economy. But I think there's like a thing on the internet that's like written by him and some kind of some other like German, like, I don't know, radical, undogmatic communist left person, taught like kind of like just mocking all the various different strands of leftism, from like academic Marxologists to like anarchists to like Trotsky, just like the whole thing. And they're kind of like just like kind of like glib, crude comments. But one of the things that they say is like, for like the Bordigas one, is like, doesn't understand that the Second World War is fundamentally different than the First World War, and that it was not just merely like the war between, say, the Soviet Union and the United States and the Allied powers versus Nazi Germany and fascist Italy was not just merely another inter-imperialist warfare where both sides were equally as evil in some way as the Nazis. That's and I think that's kind of actually like a pretty sound critique of kind of like these Bordigas, like the Bordigas, like glib comments about fascism. Yeah, but this isn't even about Bordiga, but sorry, it got me thinking about the French Bordigist kind of guy, or ultra left guy, might have actually been, I don't know, all kinds of things. He's the mixture of that weird 1970s like interaction between, council communists and Bordigists that kind of where like communization and a lot of like French ultra left shit comes out of. Those in that milieu, and there's this one guy that came out of it like a fucking total crank, and then became like a then frequented right wing circles. So thinking about Raja Garodi, who was a left winger who became a Holocaust denier, made me think of another French leftist who became a Holocaust denier. So yeah, I know it's not what we're listening to right now, but some interesting thoughts. Or the flagrant absurdity of the practical futility of these fables being implicitly recognized opposite an effectively non-homogenized proletariat that has retained its, quote, illusions, end quote, its, quote, false representations, end quote, or quite simply this astonishing and unbearable human faculty for a diversity of opinions must line up a faction, a party, which itself has neither illusions nor false representations, nor opinions, for it possesses the true theory. It thus is able to distinguish between workers who think and act according to the, quote, essence of their being, end quote, and others who are workers only empirically and phenomenally, and as such can and should be reduced to silence, at best, quote, educated, end quote, paternalistically, at worst qualified as false workers to be sent to, quote, re-education camps, end quote, or shot. makes me think of one of the debates, within like within the Bolshevik Party in the early 1920s, and Lenin's going on this spiel about how we don't have a working class anymore because the working class, they all died, they all either became party functionaries or they died in the Civil War, despite there obviously still being a working class. And Alexander Shliapnikov standing up, who is a member of the workers' opposition and a trade unionist, and the ins and outs of his politics at various points in his life are complicated and not worth talking about right now. But he said, it's like, yeah, well, this is the only working class. Our working class might not be this kind of like idealized working class that you think is like existed, or like this kind of like reified, like, I don't know, essentialized idea of the Russian working class, but the working class as it exists now is the only working class we have and are going to get. So that's kind of a thought that I had. Check out the theses of the. I read the theses of the workers' opposition written by Alexander Shliapnikov on here. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, check that out. This theory being true, that is, according to the Marxian conception, corresponds to the interest and the historical role of the proletarian class. It and the party embodying this theory can pass over the heads and the cadavers of empirical workers to rejoin the essence of a metaphysical proletariat. The various, quote, positions, end quote, of Marxists today on this question are a, quote, dialectical, end quote, concoction made from these two radically incompatible conceptions and held together principally by duplicity and bad faith. But let us consider the thing itself. Let us postulate a pure hypothesis, the existence of a Marxist who recognizes reality, who therefore grants that the, quote, proletariat, end quote, is not actually homogenized, that homogenized or not, it can contain or actually contains varying currents of opinion, and that the possession of any theory neither permits nor authorizes one to discriminate between these opinions and to decide in the place of the proletariat and for the proletariat what is to be done and not to be done. Such a Marxist could be a, quote, council communist, end quote, or a Luxemburgist, quote, historically the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are infinitely more fruitful than the infallibility of the clever Central Committee, end quote, who would have rid himself of Rosa's mechanistic economics, and who could keep his eyes open to see what was going on in the real world as it is today. Could such a Marxist still talk, while remaining coherent and honest, of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, understanding thereby the dictatorship of the autonomous collective organs of the proletariat? Certainly not, for several reasons. First, because the very concept of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, has become totally inadequate. It might have been meaningful to speak of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, as, quote, subject, end quote, of the socialist revolution when one believed that there was a concept not shot full of holes that could correspond to a massive and clear-cut social reality. This concept could have referred to manual workers, or as I thought all during the initial period of socialisme ou barbarie, of wage earners and salaried workers, whether manual or not, who have been reduced to roles of mere execution. Today, however, in the countries of modern capitalism, almost everyone is a wage earner or salaried worker. Manual laborers, as well as, quote, pure executants, end quote, have become a minority of the population. If one has this minority in mind, it is impossible to speak of the, quote, dictatorship of the immense majority over an infinitesimal minority, end quote, as Lenin had done. If one speaks of, quote, wage earners, end quote, and, quote, salaried workers, end quote, in general, one ends up spouting absurdities. Top engineers and bureaucrats, etc., would be included in the, quote, proletariat, end quote. Small farmers, petits paysans, or craftsmen would be excluded therefrom. This is not some sociological discussion. What is at stake is political in character. Either the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, signifies nothing, or else the dictatorship of the proletariat signifies, among other things, that the stratum not belonging to the proletariat have no political rights, or have only the limited rights the, quote, proletariat, end quote, chooses to grant them. I think that's a very important observation, actually. I mean, the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat would mean just like whatever arbitrary thing that the government, a workers' government could want to do about X, Y, and Z would be legitimate is deeply problematic. The present-day partisans of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, should have the courage to explain that they are in principle for the abolition of the political rights of farmers, craftsmen, massage therapists working at home, and so on. Also, that the publication of medical, literary, philosophical, and other such journals should depend on ad hoc authorizations granted by, quote, the workers, end quote. Who then is, quote, proletarian? And who defines who is, quote, proletarian? And who is not? Those who write about the distinction between productive and unproductive labor in Capital. Prostitutes working in a whorehouse for an ex-boss would belong to the proletariat. According to Marx's criterion in the Grundrisse, they produce surplus value. Those who are self-employed do not produce surplus value. The former would therefore have political rights, the others not. Yet, alas, precisely on the question of productive and unproductive labor, Marx contradicts himself, and the exegetes cannot figure out how to settle the matter. We will have to await a settlement on this and a few other questions from the Central Committee. Will we have to await on a settlement on this and a few other questions from the Central Committee? In reality, what is at stake here is something much deeper than the term, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, or even, quote, proletariat, end quote. It is the entire theory of, quote, classes, end quote, the full sovereignty attributed to the economy by the capitalist imaginary, which Marx inherited in full, finally, the whole conception of the transformation of society. A grotesque version is to be found again in the litanies recited by the CERES and others on the, quote, class front, end quote. What, quote, front, end quote, and what, quote, class, end quote. Social transformation, the instauration of an autonomous society, concerns, as I have explained for a long time, in fact and in principle nearly everyone, minus perhaps 5 or 10% of the population. It is nearly everyone's business, and only to the extent that nearly everyone makes this his business. May 68 provides a striking illustration both positively and negatively. Where was the, quote, class front, end quote, in May 68? This is not just a question of arithmetic, nor does it relate to the attitudes of this or that social stratum of this or that at this or that conjuncture. The historical preparation, the cultural and anthropological gestation period for social transformation cannot and will not be the work of the proletariat either exclusively or as privileged participant. There is no question of granting to any social category in particular a sovereign or, quote, hegemonic, end quote, position any more than the contributions of various strata of society to this transformation can be hierarchized and subordinated to those of any one of these strata. The profound changes introduced into contemporary social life by movements that can have neither a, quote, class, end quote, definition, nor a, quote, class, end quote, foundation, like those of women and youth, are just as important and germinal for the reconstruction of society as those introduced by the workers' movement. On this point, one can again observe the profoundly reactionary character of the Marxist outlook. If Marxists of all stripes, Stalinist, Trotskyist, Maoist, Socialist, and so forth, first ignored, then combated, and finally tried to co-opt by emptying of their content the movements of youth and women, it is neither simply by myopia or by imbecility. Imbecility. That's a fun word. Here, for once, they were consistent with the underlying spirit of the outlook they profess as their own, certainly not by a sudden and immoderate love of consistency, which is not their strong suit, but because their politico-ideological existence depends on it. They exist as, quote, directors or, quote, spokesmen of the, quote, proletariat. As a Marxist is obliged to affirm that all these movements are minor or secondary, or he ceases to be a Marxist. For his theory tells him that everything is subordinate to the, quote, relations of production, end quote, and to the social classes defined by these relations. How could anything else of true importance have come from another source? Now, in fact, what has been put into question by the women's and youth movement, by the immense anthropological mutation they have unleashed, which is now underway and whose course and effects it is impossible to foresee, is sociologically just as important as what the workers' movement has put into question, in a sense even more so for the structures of domination these movements have assailed. The domination of male over female, the enslavement of the younger generations proceeds historically, for all we know, the instauration of a division of society into, quote, classes, and is rooted very probably in much more deep-seated anthropological strata than the domination of some over the work of others. The transformation of society, the instauration of an autonomous society, involves a process of anthropological mutation that quite obviously could not and cannot be accomplished either uniquely or mainly in the production process. Either the idea of a transformation of society is a fiction without any interest, or the contestation of the established order, the struggle for autonomy, the creation of new forms of individual and collective life are invalidated and will invade, through conflict and with contradiction, all spheres of social life. Among these spheres, none plays a, quote, determining, end quote, role, even, quote, in the last instance, end quote. The very idea of any such, quote, determination, end quote, is nonsense. Lastly, and especially if the term and the idea of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, have become hazy, the term and the idea of dictatorship in no way are and never have been so. What quite obviously distinguishes Lenin or Trotsky from the Althusers, the Balabars, and the Ellensteins is that they were not paid by the word. The political existence of a genuine statesman, be he totalitarian, cannot be confused with the political inexistence of needy ideological functionaries. It is of the same order as the difference between Ava Gardner and the ugly old maid eaten up by dreams, in which she is Ava Gardner. Lenin knew what dictatorship always has meant and always means, and he expressed it admirably. Quote, like a blind puppy, casually sniffing first in one direction and then in another, Kautsky accidentally stumbled upon one true idea, namely that, quote, that dictatorship is the rule unrestricted by any laws, end quote. This is indeed the original and genuine meaning of the term dictatorship. He who exercises power dictates what is to be done and is bound by nothing. Not only is he bound by, quote, moral laws, quote, basic or, quote, constitutional laws, quote, general principles, end quote, as for example the non-retroactivity of laws, which a dictatorship can always ignore. He is bound by absolutely nothing, not even by what he himself has dictated the day before. Dictatorship signifies that the dictatorial power can shoot people today because they obeyed laws that it had itself decreed yesterday. Side note, and when the new economic policy was instituted in the Soviet Union after the very serious problems and the very serious revolts that responded to those problems of war communism. uh, the Soviet state encouraged the peasantry to, quote, enrich themselves in order to get production up and moving again, when they figured out that you know, grain requisitioning at the barrel of a gun of terrified peasants wasn't quite a sustainable manner of reproducing the Soviet Union agriculturally. Um, Later, those people who did in fact enrich themselves were cast as kulaks, which is a very um, debatable term. What the hell a kulak actually means? Um, um, because to my understanding, and I think it's generally historically accurate, that capitalism, in the sense of vast estates with agricultural wage laborers being hired by ostensibly successful peasants, was not, to my understanding, I'll be wrong, but to my understanding, was not something that was very much common in the Soviet Union, and the persecution of of the kulaks was something that had to be whipped up by the state. Um, did not emerge from the ground up of peasant society. Um, on there was actually I might have mentioned it before somewhere, but there's a video on YouTube about um, these documents of the left opposition that were like recently found when like workers in Russia were like I don't know, demolishing like an old prison or something, and there was old like documents from the left opposition that were stored in like a wall or something like that, and people were talking about it. This is on the Haymarket Books website or YouTube channel, and the guy who's very actually smart. I've heard him comment on Kronstadt. He has a paper on Kronstadt that I've actually put up on here. His name's Alexei Gusev. He's like from um, I think he runs a thing called like the Victor Serge Library in Russia, or did. Um, and but he's written on other things pertaining to Soviet Union in the revolutionary and immediately post-revolutionary era. And he emphasized that, like, you have to put all the terms that were being used in this period um, in quotation marks. Quote left, quote right, kulaks, smichka, which is the unity of the peasants and the working class. All these kind of like concepts that were tossed, these like uh, concepts that were being tossed around by the Bolshevik elite, should be like very, very should be put in scare quotes and kind of used with extreme caution. But yeah, basically, I'm just saying that because it says dictatorship signifies that the dictatorial powers can shoot people today because they obeyed laws that it had itself decreed yesterday, which is precisely what happened in the process of dekulakization. There is no point in saying on behalf of. Oh, and another example of this is the in Mao's China, when they had the when in the 1950s. I forget the words for it, but the the 100 Flowers movement, in which criticism of the regime would be allowed by intellectuals and just general people within the Chinese party. The idea there's like, oh, we're gonna have this flourishing, vibrant democracy. Um, when those critiques became more for the PRC under Mao to a to bear, they launched the anti-rightist movement, basically calling forth criticism of the state as a gesture of opening towards democracy, and then smashing anybody who actually criticized the regime from whatever direction in any substantial kind of way. It was called the anti-rightist campaign. That's an example of another example of the dictatorship telling people to do something. When they do it, they're punished for it. Also, as a side note from that, it's very much important to remember that in Mao's China, there was also a less well-publicized anti-leftist campaign, although I don't believe it went by that name. But if you look up the history of people even within the Communist Party, such as I think it was Hu Feng, I think was the novelist or poet who was like put in prison for like 30 years for like some arbitrary miscommunication about the nature of, or some fucking abstract, conversation or disagreement about the nature of socialist realism and what were socialist aesthetics. He was in prison for like 30 years, and also like the very extreme repression that was conducted against Chinese Trotskyists within the PRC in the early 1950s, which is not as well talked about, nor is any of the persecution by the Stalinist regimes that emerged in Asia in the 20th century. Their relationship with the dissident left in those countries is largely ignored, even by dissident leftists in America. Yeah. Anyway, there is no point in saying on behalf of dictatorial power that such behavior would be absurd and counterproductive from its own point of view. Stalin spent a good part of his life doing exactly that. Nor is it a matter of knowing whether the individual or collective dictator might judge, in his own interest, that it would be better to avoid being arbitrary. It is a matter of understanding that to speak of dictatorship signifies abolishing all limits to the arbitrariness of power. The idea of a power, Stalin or Mao, the proletariat or God the Father, unbound by all law would lead to anything other than total tyranny, is absurd. Quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, implies that, in this or that particular case, the, quote, organs of the proletariat, end quote, could change the definition of crimes and penalties, as well as the rules of procedure and the judges. Were it to be exercised by Saint Francis of Assisi, we must struggle to the death against that kind of power. All this is not a matter of quibblings and subtleties. We have the proof of the contrary at both ends of the human spectrum, the monstrous certainty, but also the sublime. The idea of power unbound by law, quote, written, quote, positive law, was, as we know, defended by Plato, and this within a problematic that cannot purely and simply be dismissed out of hand. What Plato says in The Statesman is that ideally opposed to law, which is like, quote, an arrogant and ignorant man, end quote, incapable of taking into account either changes in circumstances or individual cases, is the, quote, royal man, end quote, who knows each time how to decree and how to dictate what is just and what is not, to decide the specific case without crushing it beneath an abstract universal rule. In this sense, and strictly speaking, law is, for Plato, only a makeshift solution required by the deficiencies of human nature, and in particular by the improbability of the, quote, royal man, end quote, or the, quote, philosopher king, end quote, as he elsewhere writes. At the same time, however, Plato is realistic enough to write, twice over, the laws of that city that, in his view, would be just. It can easily be shown that the discussion of law in The Statesman cannot be underestimated either in its profundity or as to its relevance for today. First, it is this discussion that opens up the question of equity. Quote, at the same time justice and better than justice, end quote, as Aristotle profoundly said. Equity can never, by definition, be guaranteed by law. The question of equity is the question of the achievement of effective social equality, even in a, quote, static, end quote, social setting, among ever unequal and dissimilar individuals. Second, and especially for the reasons indicated by Plato, never, absolutely never, could the question of justice be settled simply by law, and infinitely less still by a law given once and for all. Beyond all the imaginable, expedient, quote, empirical, end quote, answers that could be provided, the question Plato poses brings out the depth of the substantive political problem. On the one hand, society cannot exist without law. On the other, the law or any law does not and will never exhaust the question of justice. Furthermore, it can be said that, in a sense, law, right, is the contrary of justice. Without this contrary, however, there can be no justice. Once society has exited from religious, traditional, or other forms of heteronomy, as autonomous society, it will never be able to live except in and through this ineffaceable gap, which opens it to its proper question, the question of justice. A just society is not a society which has adopted once and for all just laws. A just society is a society in which the question of justice remains constantly open. In other words, a society in which there is always the socially effective possibility of questioning the law and the law's foundation. This is another way of saying that it is constantly in the movement of explicit self-institution. Here again, Marx remains much more the Platonist than he believes, both when he advances the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and when he leaves the impression that during the, quote, higher phase of communist society, end quote, law, quote, by nature unequal, end quote, he says, would disappear, because there would be a, quote, universal blossoming of individuals, end quote. Here, the, quote, total man, end quote, has simply taken the place of the, quote, royal man, end quote. Marx, like Plato, relativized the given law, and they were right to have done so. Nevertheless, Marx and Plato also relativized law as such, and here is where Marx and Plato slipped up. From the obvious and profound discovery that every law is always defective and inadequate, due to that law's abstract universality, Plato draws the, quote, ideal, end quote, conclusion that the only just power would be that of the, quote, royal man, end quote, or the, quote, philosopher king, end quote, and the, quote, real, end quote, conclusion that movement must be arrested. The collective must be cast once and for all in a mold so calculated as to reduce as much as possible the in principle ineradicable gap between the actual, quote, matter, end quote, of the city and the law. Marx draws the conclusion that in arriving at a society of regulated spontaneities, law and right will have to be done away with, whether because the abolition of alienation would bring back man's original good nature, or because, quote, objective, end quote, social conditions and the rearing of subjects would permit a complete resorption of the institution and of its rules by the psychosocial organization of the individual. In both cases, as moreover in all hitherto existing political philosophy, there is a misrecognition of the essence of the social historical and of the institution, a misrecognition of the relationship among collectivity, law, and the question of law. Plato misrecognized the collectivity's capacity to create its own regulation. Marx dreamed of a state in which this regulation would become completely spontaneous. The idea of a society of regulated spontaneities, however, is simply incoherent. Aristotle would rightly have reminded Marx that such a society would hold good only for wild beasts or gods. And if it were said that, quote, that in the, quote, higher phase of communism, end quote, dreamed of by Marx, right and law would be superfluous because the rules of social coexistence would have then been completely interiorized by individuals and incorporated into their structure, we would have to fight to the death against such an idea. A totally interiorized institution would be equivalent to the most absolute tyranny, and at the same time, a totally interiorized institution would mark the halt of history. No distance with regard to the institution would any longer be possible, nor would a change in the institution be conceivable. We can judge and change the rule only if we are not the rule, only if the gap remains, only if an exteriority is maintained, only if the law is posited opposite us. This is the very condition that permits us to call it into doubt, that enables us to think otherwise. To abolish heteronomy does not signify abolishing the difference between instituting society and instituted society, which in any case would be impossible, but to abolish the enslavement of the former to the latter. The collectivity will give itself rules, knowing that it itself is giving them to itself, that these rules are or will always become at some point inadequate, that it can change those rules, and that they bind it so long as it has not changed them in a regular way. Cornelius Castoriadis, April-May 1979.